The Holy Gospel according to Mark. Glory to you. Jesus and the disciples went on from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying, and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." The word of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. For today's sermon, I'm going to invite you to write something down. That's going to come a little later, but I want you to go ahead and gather the supplies you'll need now. So in the pews there by the center aisle, there's some slips of paper. So you might want to grab one of those and a pencil or something else to write with. I'll give you instructions about what to do with that in a few minutes. But just have that at hand for when that time comes. For now, though, let's hear these words again from the gospel reading. "Then Jesus took a little child and put the child among them and said, 'Whoever welcomes a child like this in my name welcomes me.'" Those sound like pretty powerful words, don't they? And the reason Jesus speaks these words to his disciples is because a controversy has developed. There's been an argument among the disciples, and Jesus needs to wade in to try to set everyone straight. Don't you imagine that Jesus had to break up fights and intervene in arguments with his disciples from time to time? The disciples, bless their hearts, weren't always the brightest bunch, but who can blame them? They went from lives as fishermen and farmers, common folk, to lives as the inner circle of Jesus, the Son of God. So they don't always get things right, and they rarely seem to understand. And that's what happens in this gospel story we've heard this morning. The story begins with Jesus telling the disciples, for the second time actually, what is getting ready to happen to him. Jesus told them that soon he was going to be betrayed and killed, and that 3 days later he would rise again. Now, we obviously know what this means. We know how this story is going to go, but the disciples weren't so sure. This betrayal and suffering, dying stuff that Jesus had told them about twice now, well, they just weren't getting it. That's in fact what the story says. Verse 32 says, "But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him." They did not understand, and they were afraid to ask. Have you ever felt like that? Have there been times in your life where you didn't understand and you were afraid to ask? That's probably something we've all felt one time or another. Like, I take my car to the mechanic, and the mechanic tells me, the problem here is that you need your front end calipers recalibrated, and that's going to cost you because to get them, I have to unhinge the lateral dauber. And I shake my head and say, "Oh, that makes sense." Life presents us, doesn't it, with these situations where someone tells us something and we're supposed to get it, but we really don't. And so we pretend we do. Or we just keep quiet about it. Is that what the disciples were doing? Pretending? Just keeping quiet? I mean, why didn't they ask Jesus what he meant? What he was talking about? What he was doing? Because they were afraid. They were afraid to ask a question. Now here's the thing. What happens next in the story? Next comes the argument, the controversy among the disciples. And what is it they were arguing about? They were arguing about who was the greatest. Who was the greatest disciple? Who among us is the greatest disciple, they asked. That's what they were saying to one another. And what is that? It's a question. That's the question the disciples spent their time talking about as they walked along the way. Who's the greatest? But it's the wrong question. They were asking the wrong questions. Instead of asking Jesus, "What do you mean you are going to be handed over? Why would you be killed? What is this rising on the third day thing all about?" They were asking themselves, "Hey, which one of us is the best?" Don't you think Jesus would have welcomed the chance to answer their questions? I do. I think Jesus would have rather talked to them about what his suffering and dying meant than to have to break up this silly argument. But the disciples were too afraid to ask the tough questions. And they were too self-occupied to avoid fighting over the useless ones. Is this us? Is that what we're like? Isn't that what we do with God in matters of faith? We get too afraid to ask the tough questions, to wrestle with the things we don't get, and too self-centered to avoid worrying about our greatness, our own reward. I'll admit that's me some of the time with God, with faith. We're supposed to get it. We're supposed to get it, but it's easy to pretend or just to keep quiet about things. Somewhere along the way in life, we get the idea that it's not okay to question, that to ask questions is to show you aren't intelligent or that you're lacking in some way. But you know what? With God, that just is not true. I don't think God ever tires of our questions. I don't think God ever gets tired of hearing those things from us. I think Jesus wants us to ask and to wrestle with the stuff of faith. You know how children at a young age are constantly asking questions. This is something you get used to as a parent, and then you get kind of tired of it, actually. Why? But why? Years ago, I remember when one of our boys was at that stage of life when he was asking why about everything. We visited some friends of ours who didn't have any children. They weren't used to being asked why about everything, but that day, they got their fill. Why are there stairs here? Why is there a light on this stereo? Why is your cat hiding? Why is this door locked? But why? But why? And the thing was, our friends never got tired of answering their questions. As a parent, you get used to shutting down those conversations and moving on. But that day, our boys got to ask as many questions as they could think of. And it was okay. No one told them not to. No one said, stop asking. Asking questions is okay. It's part of life. It's how we learn about the world around us. Asking questions is okay. It's part of faith. It's how we come to know who God is and what kind of life He calls us to live through Jesus. It's okay not to understand. We shouldn't be afraid to ask questions. Sometimes we probably feel like the disciples, don't we? Moving through life, hearing these things about Jesus and just not getting it. And yet we pretend we do and we keep quiet. And when we turn our attention to other things like how great we are. But I want to invite you as you walk along to ask questions. Children are great at asking questions. Maybe that's why Jesus, at the end of this story, figured the best way to get us to understand was to take a child and put this child in the middle of things. Forget greatness, arguments, controversies. Here's what faith is like. It's like a child. It questions. It gets into things. It's not afraid to ask why. So what are your questions? If you were walking down the road with Jesus today and you had the chance to ask a question, what would it be? Well, I'd like to invite you to think about that and to write down that question now on the slip of paper you have. You don't need to be afraid. It's okay not to understand. What question do you have for Jesus about God, about faith, about the Bible, about the stuff of life? Write it down. And then in a few minutes, I want you to place your question in the offering plate. Why the offering plate, you ask? Good question. Because we are offering these questions to God. Not only do we give God our treasures, our time and our talent, but we give God all we have. Our doubts, our fears, our hurts, and yes, our questions. So take a minute and write yours down now. Knowing that God can use these, that Jesus welcomes them, just as Jesus welcomes you, children of God.